Good evening. Thank you for coming. I'm Takeru Shimazaki, running TSA Forum, a workshop. So this evening we have Charles Holland, and the lecture title is Foundation Myths. Charles is an architect, teacher, and writer. He runs Charles Holland Architects, an architecture and research practice based in the UK. He's also a professor at the University of Brighton, where his research focuses on relationship of academia to practice. Charles also contributes to the RIBA Journal on the subject of utopias. Charles, as most of you would know, was a director of legendary practice FAT, and also ordinary architecture recently. While at FAT, he was in charge of a house for Essex in collaboration with the artist Grayson Perry. I was honoured to be on the judging panel of Architecture Review's annual House of the Year panel, judge in the year the project was submitted. I think it was 2016. There were some amazing projects from all over the world submitted for this prestigious award. And with the magazine being based in the UK, the tendency sometimes is for the judging panels and the editorial team to select something from international or overseas projects that are perhaps new or fresh. However, for me, this project just clearly stood out from the rest of the submissions in terms of the narrative, layers of references, and maybe sometimes humorous and sometimes heroic kind of detailing, and richness in colors, boldness, let alone its subtle kind of balance relationship to its context, both physically and culturally. The house is an exploration of the historic and contemporary character of Essex. When a lot of the submissions were quite reductive, restrained, and minimal in their approach in the design, where architecture often became the backdrop to the lives and activities, House of Essex is a brave project expressing layers of stories within the building itself. Perhaps it's more is more, which is extremely difficult to execute. I can only think of John Soane House or Gaudi that have done this quite successfully. Charles continues to be one of the leading inspirational architects of this country, with his new practice, and I, for one, I'm really looking forward to what the practice would produce in the future. Just a quick background about this evening's event before I hand over to Charles. TSA Forum is a practice-led workshop run by my practice in London. It's a workshop organized by the practice, and we decided to teach as a practice in 2006. Avoiding the kind of the university institutional politics. And in 2015, Chris Pierce, the director of the visiting school at the AA, have invited us to be part of the setup when I actually stopped teaching here. And our aim is actually to bridge the gap between academia and practice as well. And it's great to have Charles today, who's also interested in this. Since 2006, we have invited and had some amazing lectures from practitioners and former students, including Tucker Architects in Dublin, David Cohn, Tom Emerson, OMMX, Alan Jones, Summer Islam, Louis Underhill, and also photographer Iona Marinescu, product designer Sheena Zumi, and so on. And we often visited their practices with the students to see how they actually work and challenge those kind of boundaries in practice and academia. And this year we have 5 of our staff from the practice teaching the kind of mini units. And we're asking the students to design a folly, a bridge, a boathouse, and a bird hide, or a gate for wild swimming in a kind of Palladian English landscape. And we've asked the students also to study the English architects inspired by Palladio, including Inigo Jones, William Kent, Lord Burlington, and James Payn. And of course, there's this question that comes up about how do you deal with the historic language and how we approach these settings with our contemporary architectural interventions. And I think it's therefore great honor to have Charles this evening, who is also dealing with these issues, I believe, and challenging exactly these kind of issues to do with the thread of architectural history and what it means to be a contemporary architect in practice today. So, Charles.
Thank you very much to Kiro for the introduction and the invitation to speak at the AA, which is an honour. The lecture, as he said, is called Foundation Myths, and the idea behind it really is it talks about the sort of myths we tell ourselves when we make architecture or design architecture. And those myths, for me, and hopefully the lecture will start to show, that they operate on the level of the kind of origin myths of architecture itself, the origins of primarily, I suppose, the sort of classical language of architecture, and where that language comes from, and the sort of stories that develop to explain where it came from. But it also works on the level of sort of personal myths that we tell ourselves when we design, the kind of origin myths that emerge as we do projects. And so in a way, the lecture is a sort of origin myth of its own, which is a sort of reflection back on a whole series of projects made at different times, but sort of looking at them through this lens of the idea of a kind of where do things come from and how does one learn from things that have happened before. So I'm going to begin pretty classically, really, with an illustration from Logier's essay on architecture, which is a depiction of the primitive hut, which you could say, or has traditionally been seen as the kind of first house, the first piece of architecture. And it's constructed from timber, which has been formed into a kind of the very beginnings of what you could see as the classical language of architecture. Columns, portico, and the beginnings of how the sort of decorative aspects of that, capitals and other forms of ornament, start to sort of grow out of that, literally and metaphorically, and in the foreground is kind of the sort of ruins of classical architecture that are coming out of that. So this is a sort of a hugely influential drawing, one of perhaps many, over a kind of course of centuries in a way, that starts to describe the beginning of architecture in this sort of primal state. And it's an image that appears in Joseph Whitworth's book, Adam's House in Paradise, the first house. It's directly relevant to the first project I want to show, which is actually called Foundation Myths, which is an art project in the grounds of York Art Gallery. This is a drawing of the sort of historic precinct of York, and you can see the ruins of the monastery, and to the sort of barbican, the walls which describe this precinct. And then to the north of that is an orchard, market garden, and then to the sort of nestling in that is the site of what is now York Art Gallery. There isn't a pointer, is there, of any kind? I'll carry on, maybe one will appear. So these two drawings show that site again, which is now a kind of sculpture garden of York Art Gallery. The picture on the left shows it as a garden, as a market garden, a series of orchards with, you can see the sort of defensive walls around it. And the picture on the right is a thing called the Great Shed, which was built for the Yorkshire Fine Art and Industrial Fair, which was a kind of smaller, brilliant. Thank you. How does that work? Look at that, fantastic. Which was built for a sort of, I guess, a sort of more regional version of something like the Great Exhibition in Crystal Palace. So it's a kind of huge exhibition hall. And it stayed through to the Second World War when it was destroyed by bombing. And the site was then used by Canadian airmen as barracks. So the beginnings of this project are really the kind of various layers of history of this site. So it was used various as an orchard, as a market garden, as a site for this fair, as a home of the of this building, then of barracks, and then finally it is kind of restored and remediated, but sort of empty, waiting for a kind of programme of art. And so the project I did was the first piece of work that would go into this space, which is kind of capped off, so you can't kind of dig very much down. It's got very shallow foundations that you can dig. You can see the kind of barbican around it, and the abbey is back over here. And then these are some other ruins of kind of columns from that building, which sort of littered the space. And when I went there, people were sort of sitting on them and using them as sort of informal benches and stuff. And that became a starting point, really, for an idea that a series of tree trunks, literal tree trunks in one sense, which are arranged in a grid which is suggestive of either a sort of petrified orchard or forest, or possibly the remains of the kind of columns of a building. So there's an idea that this thing was sort of the foundations of something, but sort of foundations of multiple things that had occupied the site. And I should say that the York Art Gallery is the Centre for Ceramic Art, so there was a sort of direct relevance to using ceramics to make these pieces. And so they're arranged in this sort of in a grid formation, which is on axis with views from the gallery as you look out of particularly the ceramics section of the gallery. And they negotiate a slight change in height, so that the top of the tree trunks stay the same. So they're kind of benches that you can sit on them, like a gnome up here, and then they become quite tall objects, so they go down the slope. And they were we made a whole series of maquettes, and then we made one-to-one models. These were made in a workshop in Darwin by the same people who made the tiles on the House for Essex, and I will get to that later. And we made kind of one-to-one clay models of the tree trunks, and then casts from there, and then a series of these, which are meant to be really like sort of giant ornaments. They're kind of ornaments that you might find on a mantelpiece, which have been blown up, or they're kind of petrified trees. So there's an attempt to make things which have a number of sort of associations without necessarily being any one of them. And they're arranged in this grid in the site, and as I say, they kind of get taller to describe this datum. And then I was one over, so that's I put that one in my garden where it sits, and loads of people come round and go, what on earth is that? Why is there a strange acid yellow tree trunk in your garden? Good thing about doing stuff with ceramics, there's always a few things over. So I'm going to talk about a project these projects, I should say, are sort of done, as Takiro suggested, in different guises and with different partners. That project I did really as ordinary architecture, and this project is a slightly older one, which I did when I was, Fats did, I should say. In the 2012 Venice Biennale, we were invited to go there by David Chipperfield. Well, I think actually we were invited to go there by Kieran Long, and then he only later told David Chipperfield that he'd asked us. And we did an overall kind of installation which is called the Museum of Copying. And so it involved various pieces and other people, including San Rocco and A.S. Weisman, doing projects which were about the idea of plagiarism, copying, learning from history in various different ways. And the sort of central piece in that was ours, which was a kind of copy of perhaps the most copied building ever, which is Andrea Palladio's Villa Rotonda. So that's it, the original, but as I say, it's copied in all sorts of forms, and it's copied in kind of high, low, bad, good, all sorts of different ways that sort of really, I guess, throw open the idea of the copy, which is something that generally, in art and certainly in academic context, is an incredibly troubling concept. In academic context, plagiarism is a punishable offence. In architecture, it's what we do all the time, but it's very hard to say that. And of course, it's a completely, in a modernist context, and in a context where the original, the heroic and original, are what perhaps I certainly was taught to kind of admire in architecture, the idea that one learns through copying, through the redeployment of existing elements is actually quite a kind of profound idea. And of course, the classical language works like that, and of course, Palladio produces his books of architecture, which are primarily books, pattern books for other people to use. So copying is absolutely embedded fundamentally in this. It's only perhaps in a contemporary situation where that appears to us to be problematic. We like to think of our work both as coming from the era in which we live fundamentally, therefore how could it be similar to something from a hugely different era, and that it springs from a kind of, fountainhead of genius and originality. So obvious examples of Palladianism, which I'll come back to as well, another project, which is this kind of hugely influential style of architecture after his work. This is Lord Burlington at Chiswick House. This is obviously Jefferson at University of Virginia. And these are sort of very high architectural copies of this, but there are many, many others, that you could say almost endless copies of this building. If one's going to make a copy of it, though, I suppose you have to think, what are you going to make a copy of? Because all copies are different, they're never the thing. And what thing do you take to start with? We weren't going to go and make an exact replica of the original, that would be quite tricky. So there were obviously drawings, but there were drawings by different people, there were drawings with slightly different information. And there were drawings, of course, with more or less provenance and authenticity. There are bad drawings, there are SketchUp models that one can find and go, well, that is with a rotunda. I mean, nothing is ever a perfect version, and that one certainly isn't. So we alighted on the idea of using perhaps the sort of poorest source we could find. I very rarely drink during lectures. I might really tail off towards the end in lucidity. Okay, so it's sort of SketchUp model, which then becomes broken into quarters. So I should say, and you'll see that this object sits within the arsenale, which is a series of incredibly long axial spaces within the Venice Biennale buildings. So this object sits on this incredible visual axis, and in fact was almost the first object you came to when you entered, if you entered the Biennale via its sort of most obvious route. So it became an object that was quartered, and we started to play, as one does when you're making casts, with kind of negatives and positives and insides and outsides. And so these objects go through a series of transformations as to whether you're looking at a kind of a cast of the outside that you then make another cast of, and how they're displayed. And so these are kind of versions of that, where we've got objects from inside things, and then the inside of an object, which is then transformed to the exterior, and it kind of gets reconstructed into an object that's sort of sliced down two axial routes, and you'll see how that works with the space. And it was made in a factory in Italy, which introduced a whole extra layer of losing things in translation or gaining things in translation. So the people in the Italian factory spoke no English, and we spoke no Italian. So when we got off the phone after a fairly lengthy sort of design meeting, none of us were any the wiser as to what would be happening afterwards. And they constructed these things using foam, and then casting or spraying material onto that foam in various ways. So these are pictures of it. That proves from the factory. Here it is in Venice, bit of it anyway, quarter of it, and then that's it. It's sort of sitting on the kind of axis, so that you have what you can see is one quarter of it is the exterior, the other is you're seeing the sort of interior. But when you go around the object, you start to see how it's constructed, and indeed some bits of it are sort of held together to reconstruct the object. So depending on where you are, it starts to become incredibly fragmented, or it slightly sort of reconstructs itself back into a legible object. And then you can see that the whole thing is entirely sort of fabricated through moulds. Okay, this project, I suppose there's a slightly different attitude really to the idea of sort of historical learning, and some of these things were given. This is a project I've been working on that was commissioned by the same people who commissioned the house for Essex, but for a site in Hampstead. And we were given a kind of slightly weird brief for this, which was that it's a house for, it's like a sort of Airbnb, effectively. So you rent it for a short period of time, and it's in Hampstead, so obviously it's kind of people come to London and stay in this thing for a few days. And so unlike a lot of the other houses owned by Living Architecture, who were the commissioners and commissioned House for Essex, most of those other houses are on fairly remote sites, so you kind of pitch up and imagine most of the sort of social life is actually being in the house and kind of going for walks and cooking and things like that, whereas coming to stay in London is a sort of fundamentally different experience. So it starts to be conceived as a bit more like a kind of flat share. And we were given, in a way, 3 people who are associated with Hampstead. One was Freud, one was Constable, and one was Keats. I make no apology for the sort of choice of these, because it wasn't mine. But Constable goes to live in Hampstead for a while, and he kind of paints the heath constantly. He does weird things. He paints loads of things on the heath that don't exist there, but they're kind of reconstructed from his sort of sketchbooks of things, windmills and bits of East Anglia and his childhood homes, which sort of get constructed into these slightly weird fabricated paintings. Keats, who lives there briefly before going to Rome, he dies very young, although the Keats Museum is there, which is the house that he lived in briefly. And then Freud, who basically spends his last year of his life, he comes from Vienna, brings absolutely everything, arrives in Hampstead, where he's found a home by his nephew, I think, who was an architect. But he brings everything, brings his study, he brings all these incredible objects and stuff, but he's very, very ill and he dies within a year, but he lives there nonetheless. And so we plotted where these people were and within the plan as a kind of nod to the sort of orientation of these. But the house develops as if it's some sort of weird fantasy flat share between Freud, Constable and Keats. And that their characters become expressed in bits of the interior. And I have to say, we struggled a lot with this concept at the beginning, because we were thinking, well, what stops it from becoming a bit like a really bad local museum? And I actually quite like bad local museums, so maybe that's not quite the worst outcome. But I still struggle with it. And we kind of decided after a while that the way to tackle this thing was that each of the people becomes a kind of totemic object inside the house, and their personality or their character is represented by an object. And that object is essentially your sort of suite within the house. So it contains a bathroom space, a bedroom space, and a sort of living space. And so there are 3 objects that jockey for position within the interior. Each one is a different person. So there's Keats's house, which is a sort of slightly fragmented villa, which has a tree going through the middle of it. There is Constable's house, which is a sort of tower. It's a bit like a kind of windmill, which pokes out the top and has views of the heath. And then there's Freud's piece, which is a kind of sort of series of sort of like bodily metaphors, which is inside out. So most of the private bits are on the outside. So baths and showers and stuff become objects which extend into the space. And then they all group around a really small kitchen, which they share and argue over who's drunk the milk or who's not done the washing up. And so there's an idea that they're basically, sort of people sharing this landscape. You see this is an early version where like Freud's bath is sort of set in the landscape of the interior. And so it's on a very narrow passageway near to the top of the Hampstead Hill. As an idea, this is an existing wall, which is the intention is to remove and then replace with something which, where the entrance to the house is very suppressed and hard to find. There is a sort of series of, as a kind of fake architecture or archaeology that's along the front, but there's a little door that takes you into kind of external courtyard. It's like a room, treated as a room with kind of skirtings and a cornice, but open to the sky. And then you come in, there are various sorts of bits of symmetry and sequences and stuff, but this is the kitchen. And then there's Keats, which has a sort of 1970s style conversation pit, and then a bedroom upstairs. Constable, which is this tower with a sort of circular circulation system that takes you up. And then Freud, who's kind of like sort of bursting into the living room in various ways. And then as we go up, you get kind of different rooms and stuff, and they're still sort of communicating across this shared space as an idea that the number of the stairs and the sort of landscaping echoes the landscaping of Hampstead itself. So there's a series of changes of level and narrow walkways and changes of direction, and a sense of sort of discovering objects which are effectively miniature buildings within a sort of allegorical landscape of these people. And then there's a roof terrace which has Constable Studio at the top with a kind of view towards the heath. And then this is a drawing of each of those objects, Freud, Keats and Constable, seen as sort of miniature houses within the exterior. And then this is them again, two of them are kind of pulled out. This is Keats and that's I think that's Constable. And then this sort of ruinous fragment of front wall, which is a sort of grid, which sometimes is a void, sometimes it's a window, sometimes it's a door. They're all sort of treated the same. It steps down and fragments as it's going down. There's an idea here really that this is a sort of ruined townhouse with a kind of modernist villa that's sort of hidden or emerging behind it. And this is Constable's studio that kind of pops out with a sort of Corbusian landscape. Because it's on a slope with these steps which are existing, it's kind of half buried. And so it has a very strange 3/4 scale. So as you come down here, you're actually kind of looking into the upper floor, which has actually got a staircase that's passing through it. So although in some ways it looks quite tall, when you're actually up against it, it has a sort of weird, or intended to have a weird sort of toy-like quality. And this is an elevation of that. That's that staircase, which your kind of person's head is here. So there are windows disappearing into the ground. And this is the doorway in, and this is the bin store, and this is a kind of more sort of Losian villa that's appearing behind. I should say that when you do a planning application, it's got planning approval. When you do a planning application in Hampstead, you get a different kind of objector. And I got called up in my design and access statement for incorrect use of the term Baroque when referring to a nearby building. I was quite impressed by that. And then there was a sort of quote from Nicholas Pevsner, actually on Camden's website, planning portal. It was quite amusing. Okay, this is very briefly, by way of perhaps introducing another project, is something called Entablature. I was asked to design a T-shirt for Architecture Foundation, and I did this project after we did Origins, but I became very interested when I was doing Origins, which I'll show in a minute, with the idea of the creation of sort of human proportion to classical mouldings. This is a drawing by Serlio, I think, which relates the mouldings of the Entablature to human proportions, and obviously a kind of perfect human proportion at that. And then this is a more, I don't know where this is from, kind of classic sort of pattern book of Doric entablature, naming those elements. So I thought that, I decided that the kind of perfect human proportions of this applied to the T-shirt might be a nice way to do it, which might be kind of hatched in, or might just be a single line, and that this thing would then obviously have to cope with the imperfect proportions of the person who was wearing it, and that there would be a sort of strange mismatch between the two. And so that's the T-shirt, and then here's some very nice people modelling it, whose proportions are probably slightly too ideal for my purposes, but standing in front of Pup's HVAC installation for some reason. So it kind of then starts to distort over the body. It's a very good. I got congratulated on this by one person only, and that was Francis Terry, and I was like, that's a tick for me, really, in my personal career trajectory. And then he asked me where I got it from, and I said, it's Serlio. And he said, oh, that's interesting, I haven't used him. So there you go. If you see him getting into Serlio, it's my fault. This is really one from the archives. This is a FAT project from years ago, I think from the year 2000, but I put it in because when I spoke to Kiro, it's incredibly, I thought it was very relevant to an idea of trying to add to a kind of picturesque English landscape and park, and to deal with the history of follies. And we were commissioned by English Heritage to do this, who owned a stately home in Northumberland called Belsay Hall. Belsay Hill was built by a aristocrat who'd been on a grand tour, learnt about architecture, came back and thought, I'll have a go, and built a kind of very strange neoclassical house out of the stone that he quarried from his own grounds. We thought we would enact our own budget-priced version of the Grand Tour by buying this book and doing a sort of version of something in it, slightly ineptly. That was our plan. And it was an interesting book because obviously we used it quite a lot. And it had our series of architectural drawings which were anonymous, and there were just one drawing of each project on the whole. So you got whatever that, there was no privileging of what kind of projection it was. It might be a plan, it might be an elevation, whatever. And there was no information about it whatsoever, which is quite a sort of interesting, refreshing way to sort of view the history of architecture, like a kind of constant slideshow of stuff without ever finding out anything more behind each one. When we did it, I think Jeremy Till described it as historically challenged, which is a compliment, we thought. This was the drawing that we took, which actually turned out to be a church in Alsace, which is actually built. And there's a picture of it in Gombrick's History of Art, but we didn't know that when we found this. We just quite liked its sort of repetitious forms, and you'll see a bit more of that kind of thing later. I mean, I guess we liked its sort of formal qualities in quite a kind of like unsophisticated way. Like, it's just something quite interesting about these objects which scale up and distort from each other but are self-similar at the same time, and that we didn't know what was going on around there was also quite interesting. We'd have to make that bit up around there, and we could almost learn at this, we could sort of make this thing up, but like, well, what actually would it be if you remade it with limited information? So this is what we ended up with, which is a sort of stunted version of it in the garden, clad in things called air movies, which are like little sequins which are pinned to the surface so that they move, they flutter in the wind. They often used West End for kind of advertising, and second-hand car showrooms employ them quite a lot. We did a whole series of projects with them for about 5 years. We couldn't do anything that didn't involve air movies, but this was probably the more interesting way to use them because they kind of cover that three-dimensional surface. So they started off as architectural decoration that then folds over surfaces, and as it goes up, it actually just disintegrates and becomes something which is its own background, becomes a kind of sky, and the two towers become one tower. The object gets shrunk. This is the doorway, so a person's about this high in it, and it looks out over this landscape, which is in itself an incredibly artificial landscape, which is partly a quarry in order to build the house that's built originally, and of course the picturesque landscape is a kind of an artificial exercise in naturalism. It's something which is a sort of man-made or man-enhanced landscape that is trying to appear natural in a sort of painterly way. So you could say the picturesque landscape is also something that's constructed from images. So people might use paintings of Claude Lorraine or perhaps a Grand Tour, and then come back to England in this case and construct a landscape which is based either on a sort of memory or a painting, which is, I guess, analogous to how we made this object. Okay, Origins was an exhibition that Ordinary Architecture did about a year ago. It ran for a few months in the Royal Academy, and it was an amazing opportunity in a way, because the Royal Academy is undergoing a kind of major refurbishment of David Chipfield master plan, and as a consequence of that refurbishment, a number of the sort of artworks that are part of the fabric of the RA were removed, and we were invited to do a show that occupied the spaces within the RA that were sort of temporarily empty. And we used that really as a way that we could reflect both on the origins of architecture, as I said at the beginning, and also the RA's role, its sort of pedagogic role in the evolution of British architecture. And in a way that again relates back to Palladio and Lord Burlington, who is the first sort of proselytizer of Palladio's work in England. And Burlington House, this is a drawing of Burlington House in its first guise, obviously named after Lord Burlington, when it's in its sort of most Palladian phase. It's obviously written over by subsequent centuries of architecture and undergoing another refurbishment now. But if you go to the RA, this is the courtyard space that you go into if you're going to go into the main exhibition spaces. So in a way, this project is a sort of reflection on the origins of architecture, and also quite, as you'll see, quite a personal reflection, or it conflates that history of architecture with a sort of personal history. The building, as well as being, if you could see it as a sort of piece of propaganda, built propaganda for a kind of Palladian view, also contains very explicit material inside it. This is a painting by William Kent, who was a kind of collaborator in a way, a protege of Lord Burlington, which is about the valorisation of Inigo Jones, kind of first classical architecture, classical architect in Britain. And so there's a series of explicit allegorical messages that the building contains within it. This is a panel within the staircase of the RA, which are telling a story about the history of architecture and where it comes from. And obviously that story is a kind of fabrication. It's partly true and partly serving a purpose. And I guess our interest in origins, it's probably important to say this, is not to necessarily find an origin, in fact quite categorically not. Our interest is in the search, and our interest is the need to find the origin or the truth behind something rather than actually find it. So it's not that we kind of believe these myths necessarily, it's that we're interested in the kind of mechanics of how they work and what they do, and also what they give us as designers, how they sort of lead us to design something new. And so this is it's an episodic series of installations that occupy Burlington House, and it took a form in a way of our own sort of manifesto or treatise. We saw it as a bit like a kind of three-dimensional treatise on architecture, and it was split into a series of sections which are of construction, space, decoration, ornament, and the final bit, which was a sort of series of drawings, which is a kind of treatise itself. And actually, so I missed one up, precedent. So the first bit is in the entrance hall, and actually these pieces are still there. Not these ones, these are the ones that they took out, but our pieces are still there. And there were a number of pictures that are in the ceiling, which are one, which is this one, which I think is Benjamin West, called The Graces Unveiling Nature. And they're surrounded, there's the Graces Unveiling Nature, and they're surrounded by four sort of properties, which are just, air, fire, water, and earth. And that becomes the beginnings of our own sort of re-examination of these things, representation of these categories in our own ceiling painting. So this is our version, in a way, where air becomes a ventilation system, fire the insulation and heating, water is the plumbing system, and earth is the groundworks and foundations. So there's sort of, in a way in this, there's an interest, as the name of practice, ordinary architecture at that time suggested, in what are in a way are the sort of contemporary myths of how we construct things. And they might actually be incredibly ordinary. How do we start to construct a kind of mythology about aircon? How do we construct a contemporary mythology about the need for ventilation bricks? So this drawing is a sort of view up. So you've got to appreciate this on the ceiling, and you're looking up into a sort of frame of a sort of elemental structure, which is surrounded by these elements of architecture. And then there's another series of ceiling roses that orbit that one, which are by Angelica Kaufman. And these are handily labelled. So she, again, is talking about the sort of fundamentals of design or art, which are invention, design, colour and composition. And these are sort of, in a way, arbiters of architecture and the arts, which we reinterpreted with sort of architectural diagrams. This is a recycling symbol. This is a sort of space planning diagram. This is a reinforcement mesh. And this is the sort of golden section, which is sort of shoehorned into an oval, so it becomes an ideal version. And then this is them in, and I say, these are all still there at the moment, in that entrance space. And then the second thing we wanted to talk about was space, and we kind of wanted to talk about different ideas of space. and really differences perhaps between sort of modernist and pre-modernist ideas of space. And so each one of these spaces tend to have a sort of guiding text that we were relating to. And this one was, one of them was really the idea in Collage City, Colin Rowe's book, where he makes a comparison between the Unité de Habitation by Le Corbusier and the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, sorry. And he shows these two things from the air, so that it's almost as if the dimensions of the Unité could fit into the courtyard of the Uffizi Gallery. And Rowe makes a distinction, therefore, between modernist and pre-modernist space. So he says classical space is about the room, it's about bounded space. So the city can be conceived as a series of rooms, whereas modernist space is about an object in a field. So the Unité is an object that floats within a kind of continuous field of space, whereas the Uffizi is a building that defines a bounded space. So we developed a sort of idea of a sort of infinite versus bounded space. And so we produced a series of objects that explored that idea of spaces that are beyond the space of the room that we're in. So there were two very large wall paintings which were suggestive of a kind of a space beyond that of the picture frame and the room that you're in, and you experience these spaces walking up the entrance stairs. So you kind of come at them from below or you come at them top, and so the orientation of the drawing becomes something that's quite enmeshed in how you experience it. And these were a series of classic sort of fluted columns in this sort of gridded endless space. And then there was an object, which was the column itself, which was in the niche with a mirror base, and the column was sort of sliced off in the manner of a drawing, so that you were looking at a sort of representation of the column, which is projected down into an implied space in the niche. See some pictures. And these spaces have two busts. One was of Gainsborough, and one was of Turner. And so we gave our objects a personality as well. This is sort of homage to John Soane. And the other object was a homage to Mies van der Rohe. So there's a kind of eye section which is sliced at a point where it was in a kind of isometric projection, and then a kind of grid of eye section columns. And these occupy the main stairwell. That's the actual raw drawing. As you come up the main stairs. And so that's the homage to John Soane. That's the Miesian image, and then that's it in position. And then this shows each with their kind of corresponding object. So this is this very weird sliced off eye section which sits on a mirror that reflects it down, and the same thing happens here. And that's the two objects themselves. So in a way, they're sort of personalities. They're meant to be kind of people as well. Okay, and then the next section was really about it was about shelter, and the sort of text that we used was Gottfried Semper, who writes about a history of origins of architecture as not being about structure. He says it's nothing to do with like trees. It's to do with shelter. It's to do with the thing that we hang around the trees to make the space, and that the trees are secondary. They're not important. And of course, he talks about fabrics and he talks about woven things, and of course, in doing so, he introduces the idea of sort of decoration as being fundamental to architecture. So often within a kind of history, certainly within modernism, decoration is marginalised as that which is sort of added to architecture unnecessarily, probably for most modernists, and it's an embellishment of something. Semper's really interesting. He's before this, but you could read Semper as saying that decoration and pattern and colour are fundamental. So what man does first is enclose a space through fabrics, and secondary invents a framework that holds them up. So the entire privileging of structure and authenticity could be seen as being turned on its head by Semper's work. So we were interested in this idea of shelter as decoration. He also talks about animal skins and stuff, and we started to play this idea of animal skins as shelter, which are also depicting architectural surfaces, pan tiles and paving and brickwork and timber. And that these things would of course be on fabric, so they'd start to become things that are kind of like floppy, and had a sort of fabric quality rather than a kind of taut material in compression quality or tension, depending on how they're done. And so we made these two skins, which are multiple things which are stitched together, and they hang in poor old Norman Shaw's staircase. And there they are. So there were 4 of them all together, and they're kind of patchworks of these things which start to describe a sort of architecture that's built up out of contemporary architectural materials which have become decorative. They're sort of inverted in terms of their priority. And that's a bit of it. So you can see, the kind of, I guess, interest in what happens to them when they become a printed fabric. And this is the greengrocer's order, which was about precedent, and it was we thought, well, if you're going to deal with this stuff, you have to do a classical capital. It's just imperative to have a go at one, and we invented the greengrocer's order, which is a series of bits of plastic fruit that we bought from eBay, which there they are, all laid out and itemised before being reconstructed into a column. And of course, colour in architecture is another really interesting topic. And many people have written about this, probably most notably Mark Wigley writes about whiteness in architecture, and particularly the way that Le Corbusier towards new architecture presents classical architecture through a series of black and white photos and talks about them as a sort of play of masses, solids and masses in light, and talks about architecture as primarily a sculptural thing. Other people, of course, have since pointed out that the Parthenon was a richly embellished, highly coloured, polychromatic series of temples where the colour and decoration have been washed away by the centuries, and therefore you could see the sort of modernist reading of it as deeply flawed. It doesn't matter because it creates Le Corbusier's architecture, so that's all fine. But you could also see that it's not entirely, it's a sort of form of propaganda. And again, I'm interested in it not because it might be wrong or right, but because what it actually creates. So in a sense, Corbusier's misreading is absolutely great, because if he hadn't misread it, nothing would have been the same again. But we thought we'd have to do the same, so we sprayed ours white to remove the colour and create a sort of mythology of architecture of our own. So this becomes the greengrocer's order once it's gone through the sort of processes of architectural abstraction and architectural history has got to it and changed it. So then that goes in the library at the top of the RA, where we spent a fantastic couple of days going through a series of architectural treatises and their drawing collection, and then we got to curate that in this space. So we had a series of drawings by James Sterling and Serlio and Palladio and others, which sort of set up a kind of dialogue with each other. And in the centre was where you had a drawing of the creation of this, and we had our own myth as to how it was done, which was someone going shopping late at night, slightly drunk, buying a whole load of stuff, putting it in a bag, falling over, and all spills out on the floor, and then gets reconstructed into this capital. And so the last bit of that, which I really want to talk about, is decoration. This is a really amazing, it's obviously a cover, not the current one, of John Summerson's Classical Language of Architecture. A really intriguing drawing which sort of I became fascinated by because of the way that abstracts classical moulding in this weird axonometric projection. And so we did our own version of that. We started to think about these mouldings and cornices, and we started to think about this stuff as like embedded information. We read a book by George Hershey, which described the mouldings in classical architecture as nothing to do with conventional readings, but all to do with draining of blood from sacrificial victims. It's a really good book, actually. I recommend it. It's called The Lost Meaning of Classical Architecture. And he relates almost all of the language of classical architecture to a series of bloodthirsty rituals, including binding slaves and forcing them to carry immensely heavy weights, which results in caryatids and the humiliation of people by binding their feet, which creates the kind of base of the Doric column. And he talks about ritualistic sacrifice, which is always fun. But we became interested then in that this these mouldings containing information, containing a kind of story, and then that became translated into one sense a sort of autobiographical story. So this is, we came up with an idea of doing a series of British county cornices. And this, as you all obviously know immediately, is Essex. This is the coast of Essex, which is extruded via John Summerson's drawing into a kind of endless moulding. And so there's sort of interesting things here about lots of things, really. There's one about scale. This is sort of like a thing that you might recognise at one scale, but not recognise when it's done at another one. Something you might possibly recognise as a profile, but maybe not as an object. Something that, in a way, you might have a scale relationship to, in the sense that, you know, I was born about here, so I kind of know this, but of course it's rather like the SketchUp model of Palladio. It's an incredibly generalised and abstracted version of something I know in real life, like I've been here, and here, in fact, is the house for Essex. So we made two British county cornices. We made Essex and Cornwall, but also other personal reasons. This is Cornwall, which is deeply bizarre. It sort of looks like it's melted, which is really nice. And there's Essex, and they're displayed on the sort of shelf of the Sackler, and just sort of a truncated section of them. We did a series of drawings where we showed how these could be used in buildings. And they're made of foam, like the columns, the Mies and the Stone column. They're extruded foam, which is then sprayed with plaster. So they're also a bit like a drawing. You get that kind of hatching at the end. So that's sort of neatly, hopefully, some sort of effortless segue into House for Essex, which I'm going to talk about a little bit of detail, but hopefully not tediously so. Here is that coastline again, rendered this time in the beautiful manner of Grayson Perry, who is the co-author of the project with FAT. And this was commissioned by Living Architecture, kind of a dream commission, really, in many ways, as what was at that time probably the fifth in a series of houses that were available as holiday lets, which is a very, very mundane way to describe what goes on here. But the first one really that was a collaboration between an artist and an architect. And there was, from the very beginning, an idea that this would be a building that was in some way dedicated to a person, in this case, a woman from Essex, and that it was, through this, we would tell a kind of story about the sort of history of Essex and about the geography of Essex. And the house becomes effectively the end point of a sort of life story there. So you might have to bear with me as I tell you a bit about Essex, which is probably fundamentally uninteresting, but there you go. So this is what you are into. This is London. This is Kent. That's where I live there now. And then this is so Essex sort of starts adjacent to London, where it's kind of its sort of industrial fringe. There's a Thames estuary. There's a kind of a sort of industrial area of Essex, and then as you go across Essex, it becomes progressively more agricultural, and it becomes progressively posher. And so the woman, who's called Julie Cope, and this is a picture of her. I'll come back to that in a minute. Her life is really a sort of journey across this. So, and it's a life invented entirely by Grayson, but it's sort of through her life you can start to talk about these different places, and obviously, to unpack it, you probably have to know certain things, maybe about. Some of it's about him, maybe some of it about his mother, some of it's more general. But her life, very briefly, she's born in a place called Canvey Island, which is in the Thames estuary. She's born in 1953, and there's a flood, massive flood, lots of people die in 1953. She's born in the middle of the flood, and she's kind of rescued by boat. And then her family moved to Basildon, which is a kind of post-war new town, begun about 1947. So one of the first of the post-war new towns architecture of social democracy writ large. She marries a guy called Dave, who is generally fairly rotten, and he has an affair. She leaves him. They have two children. They move to Southbourne and Ferrers, which is a kind of 1980s new town, the sort of Thatcherite version. So that's the sort of social democratic vision. This is the kind of 80s vision. Where she lives for a while, and then she moves to Malden, and she Goes to the University of Essex, retrains. University of Essex about here, Colchester. And then she goes to live there and she meets a second husband, a guy called Rob, who she kind of embarks on a sort of Indian summer of love with him, and they travel the world and they have a bit of money. It'll be the first time in her life, and they go to India and they go to Taj Mahal. And when they're at the Taj Mahal, he says, if you die before me, I will build a Taj Mahal upon the River Stour. This is the River Stour. And obviously the Taj Mahal is a mausoleum to Shah Jahan's dead wife. And so he says, I'll build you an Essex Taj Mahal, which he does indeed here with the help of Alan de Botton. He built it here. And so it's at the end of Essex, it's the A12, you can drive across Essex. You can walk the Essex Way, which goes across Essex. You can sail around it if you want. And you arrive at this point. And so the house looks at Suffolk, it's kind of the end of everything. Here be monsters. And it's so conceived as a sort of pilgrimage across the county. So this is inside the house. A number of tapestries that explore aspects of her life. This is Rotten Dave. There's their children. There's Dave's Ford Capri and her being in the flood of Canvey Island. Their children and various sort of clues about certain aspects that happen in her life. And so this is the site, which is a really wonderful site. We're incredibly lucky to find. This is a railway which is coming from Liverpool Street. The A12 is nearby, so you kind of can arrive by train or road, and then you go down this road, small, narrow one, that becomes a kind of track that then goes down through two copses and down to the river, which is kind of the end of your journey, and you look across to Suffolk, and the Essex Way, which is this Ramblers route, kind of picks you up here. So you get this kind of amazing views of the house from down by the river. You can see it from boats. And it has this sort of end quality. And so this is the view from it as well. So the view is really interesting. I should say the River Stour comes out into the North Sea, and there are ports of Harwich and Felixstowe, which make this kind of industrial landscape on the horizon. And it's a quite ordinary landscape in a lot of ways. It's agricultural, paddocks for horses and stuff. Not beautiful, exactly, which is important. And as it goes inland, it goes through Dedham Vale, which is kind of colloquially known as Constable country. So it becomes much more synonymous with, I guess, a more received idea of the picturesque or the beautiful landscape. So it's a really interesting point, poised really, in a sense, between lots of different ideas of what the countryside might be, kind of big-scale logistics, leisure, commerce, agriculture, ramblers, constable enthusiasts, heritage obsessives, etc. And so I put in a couple of reference points. This is a church in Essex, which is an early reference point. When we were introduced to Grayson and we worked together, he kind of came round and he was sort of introduced like a really sort of awkward blind date. They were like, this is Grayson, and then they left us together. And he said, I don't like contemporary architecture. And we were like, that's okay, because nor did we. So we'll get on really well. And then we talked about a few things. We got a book out on the wooden architecture of Russia, and he quite liked that. And then I went, there's this church in Essex that's a bit like a wooden Russian church, and we looked at that, and he knew. And it was kind of like we started to talk about going back to that folly at the statutory project for Historic England, this idea of these sort of objects, planes of scale, of quite sort of enigmatic forms which get repeated and sort of multiplied in a way. I was very interested in the idea of this object in the landscape and what scale it might have, because it's a 2-bedroom house, it's quite small. And so this is it. It kind of it terminates a sort of view down the lane as you come towards it, and basically it's a series of kind of house shapes which get bigger as you go through the house. So that idea of a journey across Essex then kind of speeds up when you actually get into the house. The building itself, the house plan, is like an episodic movement through a series of spaces. This is an early model which starts to show that idea of it stepping up. So it's on a steep hill, so when you arrive at it, and the house in a way has two programs. It's sort of a house, and then it has this sort of ceremonial space which is dedicated to her. And if you come from this direction, it's quite small, and you go into a kind of domestic scale thing. And if you come from the other direction, you come into this big chapel space. And the interior of the house becomes about the relationship between these two. And I'll show you in the plan what that means. It's clad in ceramic tiles. These are early maquettes made by Grayson, which depict Julie, and then some symbols about her life. So these are sort of really early things, playing with colour and pattern and glaze, and the idea that she's sort of depicted pregnant and in this kind of architectural frame. Some of them are called different names because we had long struggle to find a name that no one had any embarrassing connections with. And then these are they were made by Shores of Darwin, again, who made the tree trunks earlier. They're really incredible things. They're really deep, and these are laid out for us to. The interesting thing about this, we had to lay them out and measure them, and this is how architecture works. You condemn all the ones that are outside of a tolerance for cladding systems, but we wanted the building to have a kind of handmade quality, so we condemned about none of them. We were all fine. And then at the same time, Alfred Hall Modern Morris were doing this office building, and the other half of the whole of the factory was their ones, and they condemned about 95% because they're fractionally out, and the joints wouldn't be quite perfect. So it's quite hard to do things in architecture that aren't perfect, and to do that deliberately. The whole MBS and methods of how buildings are procured is predicated on avoiding any form of mistake. This is then assembled into elevation. So here's Julie, and then there are these white and green triangles. This is a J for her. This is a nappy pin, which has something to do with motherhood, but also to do with punk. This is a tape cassette, for anyone not familiar with what one of those are. This is what ancient man used to do to record music. This is a heart, this is a wheel, you'll see a bit more about that. And then they're composed into this richly polychromatic decorative elevation. And this is the object itself. So you can see this kind of scalar jumping up. The lights of Felixstowe port in the background, and this idea that you arrive at something quite small and it kind of jumps up, and then this is the river in the background, and the pattern sort of plays with that idea of it becoming bigger as it goes down the hill. It has some sculptures on the roof. This is a wheel, which is related to how she dies. I'll tell you that in a minute. This is her again, and then a sort of chimney and a kind of beacon, and then these self-replicating dormer windows, which go from really tiny to really big. And when you're in here, this is just one room. And then as you go through, these start to light upper rooms. When we finished this building, the artworks are intrinsic to it, and they weren't completed when the building was finished. And so for about 6 months, there were only photos of the outside, and people used to say, is there actually an inside? And we used to say, no, it's ceramic all the way through. Quite nice, it's just solid. So this is the sequence of entrance to the river, and it has this very hierarchical axial plan. People used to go, oh, the gingerbread house. Like, it's not, it doesn't look, I don't know what you mean. What gingerbread? And then I looked at a picture of gingerbread house and I went, oh, okay, yeah. As another thing you're not supposed to do really is express gutters. So we had lots of gutters, gold ones in particular, and kind of nice things where the tiles reflect in the kind of blank ends as the bits that get bigger. Handrail would almost be tasteful if it wasn't bright red. Okay, so very quickly walk you through the plan. So as I said, the whole thing's really about the idea that there's there's a sort of chapel space and there's a house space and how they relate. So you come in here, you're meant to sort of come in here. This is the entrance hall, which has lit by these clerestory dormers above. Very kind of axial symmetry. You go through, there's a stair upstairs, shower room. You come into this room, which effectively appears to be kind of at the end of it all. This is a kind of big fireplace, which is entirely tiled, and the doors through are tiled as well. So it kind of forms a sort of end. If you push open the doors, which are obviously double, you kind of then go into this kind of suddenly very different space, which is far grander, far richer. But there are hints throughout the whole thing of the decorative effects in here that kind of build in intensity as you go through. If you come from the other end, you come up steps into a porch. There's a completely different kind of scale and experience to it. And if you go upstairs, there's a little bathroom with a bath suspended over the stairwell, which has a window in here, which has got a mirror film on it. So depending on the lighting levels between here and here, you could either, when you have this is a shower, you're either visible to everyone on the stair hall, or they just see a reflection of themselves. It's never entirely clear which way it might go. This is a bath, which then looks out over the kind of approach to the house. 2 bedrooms, one, and they each represents a marriage. There's a big tapestry, which is like a kind of marriage photo of the first marriage or the second. So when you go there, you kind of choose which room according to maybe how pessimistic you might be about your own romantic life at any one point. And then there's a kind of another wall which appears to be the end, which is actually opens up into a kind of walk-through cupboard, wardrobe, and then a balcony which looks out into the living room. This is a section that describes that. So this is that kind of route through, dining room, chimney and fireplace, and then this incredible kind of vertical room. This is a moped. In the mythology of her life, she's knocked over by a moped and dies. It's Honda C90, in fact. And we found one on eBay, and then it got. We took it to the workshop and we took it apart and we resprayed it, and we refitted the lights so they would illuminate the artwork. So big bank of switches, and you can turn the headlight on. There's a statue of Julie here with the headlight. The brake lights illuminate the pot, and we've tried to sell this to various art galleries around the world, but none of them have taken it up yet. And that's the bathroom. So you'll see, and then this kind of nicely has a sort of nighttime version where the lights come on. Okay, so very quickly, this is how you walk through. So very, very quickly, architectural kind of references for this, which talk about a lot. Some talk about Adolf Loos and I really love Adolf Loos's work. People always go, when I say a bit Adolf Loos in here, they always go, what are you talking about? He's the guy with the whole ornament problem and everything. And but if you look at one of the interesting things, going back to the idea of history of colour in architecture, most of Adolf Loos's early work were apartments and stuff, and they were obviously photographed at the time, mostly in black and white. They then got refitted or they disappeared. And so there's a whole sort of origin myth of Loos's work that it's kind of doesn't really have colour. When people start to reconstruct his apartments, and when in Ground Plan versus Plan Libre, the book comparing his work to Corbusier, and they make models of these interiors, you realise that they're incredibly vividly coloured. He uses kind of bright greens, bright yellows, blacks, silvers, all sorts of incredible sort of eye-popping, really, really rich and stuff. And the way he uses colour, I think, is super interesting. So some of that comes out in this stuff. There's also a lot of interest in kind of English country house planning, Edwin Lutyens' setting up of axial views that are then kind of suddenly subverted or no longer appear to lead anywhere, and the kind of use of tiling and decoration and stuff. And then I guess quite a lot of Soane, and the fact Soane's house is a mausoleum, and in a way this object is also a mausoleum, albeit to a fictional person. So you come in through the kitchen. This is a giant fireplace which has the tiled doors, and then when you open them they lead you through into the living space, and you pass through this kind of mirrored portal on the way through, which sort of reflects you infinitely before you've sort of cleansed to go in here. And then you turn around and there's this kind of big screen. And the screen contains the 2 doors back into the kitchen, the doors that come from the bedrooms onto the balconies, Julie herself, and then these 2 tapestries, and that's a bit of the tapestry I showed you earlier. The kind of whole thing then sort of erupts, really all of the decorative and motifs and colours become intense in this, and there's wallpaper which is drawings of her life by Grayson. And that's it at night with the doors to the bedrooms opened up. And then these are drawings which were sort of developed along the way, looking at this idea of this sort of screen, or this kind of rude screen, which also contains mirrors and architectural references, and Julie, and then people, and a sort of idea. This is a bit like a sort of cuckoo clock, an altar, where you become kind of part of the sort of narrative, sort of secular narrative of the screen. These are all just sort of workings of how the decoration and the architecture comes together. This is a skull on the porch with a little line from a poem that Grayson wrote, which is the sort of funeral boat of her life, and you can kind of stand on these feet and look out over the landscape. Very quick, that's the bath, which fits about 10 people. Takes about 6 hours to fill. This is the bedroom, and you can see you're kind of in the dormers. This is one of the big tapestries. This is her second marriage to Rob, which is like a huge wedding photo blown up into a tapestry. The doors that open out onto the balcony, which takes you out, and then you're kind of confronted with the moped, which amazingly, the name of the moped is Pam, which is the name of the woman that Julie's husband has an affair with. And it's entirely coincidental, and this is the wallpaper which depicts moments from her life. And this is what it looks like from the outside. This is this huge scale of the tapestries which you look at across the landscape. And I've stayed in this a couple of times. And one thing, it's actually very hard to get to sleep with this enormous eye of Julie gazing down at you. And in the other bedroom, there's one of Dave, her first husband, who's wearing possibly the most ludicrously loud shirt and tie, sort of 1970s tie, and holding a can of pale ale, which is equally disturbing. But if you, that's the view if you're looking in, but if you stay there and the view out is this mostly, which are Grayson Perry disciples who come in their droves and clad in Gore-Tex invariably, thinking that he lives there. And if you kind of acknowledge any of them, then they immediately ask if they can come in. And if you're taking the bins out in your pants, you have to be quite wary. So that's kind of strange sort of aspect of the pilgrimage, which is that quite a lot of people do come and have a look at it. And then the final slide I've got is really two people who have come. I always like this picture, I found it on Instagram, of two mods who have made a pilgrimage on their Lambretta to see it, which is kind of, as a teenage mod from Essex, there's a kind of nice sort of circularity to the idea of mods riding from Southend or something to go and have a look at, take that journey of her journey across the whole of Essex to see the house. That's the last slide. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Charles. That was great. We're going to ask some questions, and you can ask some questions in a minute. I have a few to kick off, but I just want to ask how do you actually work? What's the kind of how do you practice? What's the kind of what's the kind of ritual of your day? I mean, are you, and in that I include the question about collaboration, but how do you sit down, like roll down, start writing a book? Very intriguing.
It's a good question actually. Probably could be two different answers in a way to it. One thing I would say is I was very struck when I was doing this that I haven't really shown anything I'm working on, and that's partly because, like you, working on something which is sort of yet to emerge into the public realm based on a conversation the other day, and something else which is feels too formative to show. But they're both sort of things I'm doing at the moment, so they're quite useful as sort of descriptors of how it might work. I think I always do attempt to find some sort of narrative, I suppose, some kind of story that makes sense to me. I guess many other architects probably just don't use words or literary ways to describe what they do. But I do. I was very struck that when Grace and I presented this project alongside John Pawson and Peter Zumthor, who were presenting their houses at a living architecture event, that neither John Pawson or Peter Zumthor ever made any reference to anyone else's architecture, or indeed to architecture. They talked about, John Pawson showed a series of photographs, very beautiful photographs. Anyone who follows John Pawson on Instagram will know that he's a really good photographer who takes photographs of very intriguingly oblique references to architecture. But he just showed a whole series of pictures of heather. And then when that's how I started, and then this architecture emerged. And I showed all these, picture of Soane and a picture of Vanbrugh and stuff, and I felt it was like a very lumbering description in comparison. Like, I looked at this and then I looked at that. But I think that is a true reflection of how I personally work, which is to look at things. And I've become interested in certain things lately, and I see them kind of coming in. But there's normally, hopefully, one thing I've learned slightly, advantage of age, is to be a bit more relaxed about when anything might come together into something you're happy with. So I'm kind of reasonably happy to sort of work away at something which isn't quite what I want for a while. And at some point, it will hopefully congeal into things that make sense, both as a sort of conceptual idea and a narrative, and then some sort of material and formal and spatial qualities which intersect. And I wouldn't say it always does, but I feel more relaxed now about that than maybe when I was younger. I was like, okay, how am I going to make this thing? But also more pragmatically do slightly different tasks at slightly different times of day. So I tend to write a bit in the morning because I'm normally working on at least one thing that might be a bit of writing. And I find that's like a sit down. I find it very hard to sit down in front of the computer at the beginning of the day and do anything related to design. But I find it quite easy to write at that time, and then the design is easier later somehow. So that's a sort of routine. And I can't work at night beyond 10 o'clock. I always absolutely hated it as a student. I never did anything. I just sat there all night long going, shit, be morning soon, I've got to get this finished, and then the birds would start tweeting and I'd realise I'd done absolutely nothing. So now I just stop at 10 and I do something else, and then I go to bed. And then I wake up in the morning and I feel much better about the whole thing.
And so you work with different people, not just architects, obviously artists, but how do you work together? So do you do each of you draw, write, and then you get together, you sort of challenge each other? I mean, I'm particularly interested because you're now, I believe, working on your own.
Yes. What a relief, God.
Have you had enough?
Meddling people.
Have you had enough of...
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, the FAT collaboration, which was quite a long time, and when I first started working at FAT or with FAT, there were loads more people. In fact, there were loads of people. Some people didn't actually know who they were or what they did. There were so many people milling around. And through a process of grim determination, I carried on. But it was a very intense working collaboration. I think that we needed each other very... I certainly needed the other two quite a lot, in a sense that almost nothing went out the door unless you thought that they were happy with it. And I like to think it was the other way around as well. But I think it was very close. I remember a period of time where we felt very deliberately isolated from a lot of other things that were going on. I remember we had this office in Old Street, and we'd sit up there looking at kind of ancient books and postmodernism and stuff, and just felt like we were really in some kind of weird exile of our own making. And then I think slowly became more and more kind of re-engaged with a kind of contemporary architectural scene. But I think having gone through that very intense collaboration where almost everything was the product of kind of discourse between you, I have to say it is generally also a kind of relief to not necessarily have to talk about everything. And in a way, I think talking about things lends itself to a certain kind of architecture. And I think that was a great strength of that you couldn't really do anything unless you could explain it. So there was something, the project always had a kind of conceptual strength, I felt, because you had to convince at least 2 other people in the room to do it, let alone anyone beyond it. But of course that can be a weakness in a sense, because who wants to have to explain everything all the time? And sometimes things don't make sense, and that's a positive scenario. And you might not be ready. Sometimes you might think, I think there's a kind of kernel of something interesting here. Probably couldn't convince anyone else right now, but I would like to pursue it. So it's kind of nice to not have to necessarily justify everything all the time. And I think it maybe leads to a slightly different kind of architecture, one which is perhaps not necessarily attempting to formalise an argument.
And I'm going to pass on to you in a minute, but why classicism? As in, or why not modernism? In a sense that, I know you're modern as well, but you know, your remark about Lewis or Corb or this kind of abstraction of modernism and globalization and this kind of unification of everything. I mean, or more importantly, what is your take on cities and, you know, these kind of language of cities? So this, I suppose, my question is kind of interested in an individual project and a larger collective of language, and whether you actually believe in this, or is there a sort of, do you accept that the city is a collection of these kind of eclectic?
Yes, I think fundamentally I do. Obviously, in a sense, absolutely love and adore work of Corbusier and Loos in particular for me, and all those things. In a sense, I kind of feel that they were sort of the degree zero of one being an architect. Certainly at the point at which I trained, certainly my degree, I was taught by people who were kind of hardcore modernists in a way that one doesn't really encounter anymore. And there wasn't much sense of deviation from that. And in a way, and also that in itself is a throwback. I mean, I think that where I was at a particular point in time felt a bit like sort of probably 10, 20 years behind the AA at that particular time. So one could stand up and say, read out the 5 points of architecture and not have anyone question it. So it's kind of a weird thing. But I suppose that felt like that was the sort of landscape one just, in a way, unquestioningly sort of knew. And then the other stuff became kind of intriguing as a consequence. So the interest perhaps in postmodernism was its lack of, its toxicity, its lack of popularity, its unpleasantness. Unpleasant things were deeply interesting. And the fact that people find them unpleasant is interesting. So I've always been very interested in the kind of mechanics of taste and the mechanics of how architectural history is constructed and stuff. And then I suppose that, kind of looking at postmodern architecture and particularly probably reading things like complexity and contradiction, then maybe look at classical architecture afresh in a way. So, the stuff that I love of that does tend to be the more kind of Mannerist and Baroque work. But I probably came to it through Venturi and others. I find it's quite hard to explain, but I find it deeply emotionally fascinating. I love, it's always a kind of weird thing about my take and Fat's take on postmodernism was that it was a genuine attempt to push modernism into something new, not a rejection of it, fundamentally not a rejection of it. Fundamentally, it's there. How could one reject it? So all of it is about, I guess, attempting to make something kind of new out of that, and that we've had several decades of people recycling the tropes of modernism, and therefore that doesn't feel that interesting to do right now to me.
Okay. Any questions?
Thank you very much for... Hello? Thank you very much for a very enlightening lecture. I was very, very curious just to hear maybe very straightforwardly, in your own words, when you started looking at things, that your career is a lot about looking at things. But when did that kind of start? Did you feel like maybe in your academic life or in your professional life, there is this sort of moment when you realize that that's what I'm actually doing and that's what I actually like doing?
Yeah, that's interesting, actually. I think when I was at university, I certainly became very, very interested in sort of architectural theory, and I think the work I certainly did in my postgrad was very, first and foremost, I was sort of trying to, sort of talk about theory in some way. And it was sort of later, much later, where I started to be much more relaxed about just looking at visual references and starting to enjoy them for what they were. And now I do that all the time. And I'm kind of not quite sure when that happened, but it's very rare that I'd sort of begin a project, I'll think, okay, well, I'm trying to illustrate a point, or I'm trying to sort of, where does this sit within what I feel about contemporary architecture, actually? It's much more, it might be about, yes, it might be about looking. And I think that's, to me, that's really interesting. I've certain things that have happened along the way, writing a blog and certain kinds of relationships with people have started to make me much more interested in that kind of visual looking process. I think that's something I kind of will happily just sit and pick up a book and look at pictures of buildings and not necessarily read anything about them, which in my own personal history seems remarkable to me now, because I would have done the opposite before. I would have sat there reading Mark Wigley for like hours on end, and then I wouldn't have looked at a single picture. So I was like, what's the argument here? What's the argument? And now I guess, not uninterested in those arguments, but they don't form a starting point anymore.
In that case, I have a follow-up question. So then would you say now, in your, as I understand it, kind of new practice, more or less on your own, would you say that I would say quite radical shift in looking at references will inform the future projects to come?
Yes, yeah, I think, and it is. I think the only thing I can kind of add to that, I suppose, is working on one's own after quite a long time of sharing work, it probably naturally tends to result in a slightly more intuitive way of working, because you haven't got to tell anyone else what you're doing. Well, maybe you have to tell someone if you're, trying to explain it, but I feel quite happy about the sense that I might not know quite where I'm going, and I think, again, in a personal sort of history of working, that's quite a big shift, yeah. I think there was, certainly within FAT, a more almost continuous process of review and kind of discourse around the work. And, a continuous attempt to sort of, in a way, do things in order to show each other stuff. So you go like, okay, what do you think about that? Quite often, when Sean does lectures, he always talks about Sean Griffiths, that a lot of the work we produce just to annoy each other. Go like, look. And you go, you can't do that. You can't do that. Go, oh, excellent, right, I'm going to do that. So there was a lot of very childish provocation going on, but quite productive.
I was wondering, in particularly for the House for Essex, but also for other projects, where you were presenting many of them with all the irony that is within them and humor in certain cases. But I also find most or even all of the projects and spaces very beautiful and very pleasing. So to what extent is one thing or the other?
I've always felt quite ambivalent or maybe more than ambivalent, problematic about the reading of FAT's work as sort of purely ironic. I mean, maybe it doesn't help when I say we did things which are childishly provocative for the sake of it, but there was a genuine love of the stuff. And I think it's quite difficult now when there are people, it's difficult to appreciate fully how tediously dull the world of architecture was in about 1998. There were very few new practices, and if there were, they all were Stanton Williams. And you live in a world where, there's you guys, for instance, who are doing things which are kind of, extraordinarily exotic and beautiful, but, they're not, to me, that's enormously pleasing to see that kind of work is occurring. But we were, I think, came out of a situation where there are quite narrow parameters of what was possible. So I guess that's a long-winded way of saying a lot of our work was a genuine provocation against what we thought was quite a kind of uninteresting architectural dialogue at the time. And so we did, I always think, proceed from a point of some kind of slightly aggressive attitude to what we thought was normal. And that would be the spur to do quite a lot of stuff. I think that it would be quite tragic for that to occupy your entire life, I think, to only produce produce work because you're sort of trying to make a commentary on other stuff. But it wasn't, for me, kind of ironic. It was very heartfelt and passionate, in fact. And, when I talk about a House for Essex, to me that's an extremely emotive project. It's emotive because, it's about a place where I grew up. It's emotive because I think that, architecture is about a story which has certain kind of emotional characteristics. And this is a bit I think often they struggle with because Grayson's work is so incredibly sort of powerfully engaging, is to sort of say, the architecture has an emotional kind of content too. And for me it sort of does. And I think I'm sort of quite interested in how that works now, what the sort of emotional punch of architecture is and where it happens, and that again might relate to the idea that it's less discursive or literary and more spatial and formal and to do with material and colour. I mean, back in the day, and this was Sam Jacobs' phrase, taste not space, which is a sort of provocative thing. It's sort of like, space was privileged and taste was kind of our thing, where we're saying actually it's really fundamentally important. But obviously it's an absurd thing to say and incredibly reductive. But it was important to say it maybe for us at the time. But now obviously, space, which we were kind of antagonistic towards sort of ideas of the way the word space was used, because it seemed to us to be kind of slightly flabby and meaningless at the time. Some of it's flabby meaninglessness I quite like now.
I mean, I've got just the, with all this young AA students as well. It's maybe a slightly boring question, but I read an article that you wrote, I think it was in the AJ, about architectural practice as a business, or something about sort of...
Yeah, I'm an expert on that.
So being an architect is one thing, as an artisan, but then practice as a business, I think, of that nature. And I kind of, the way you describe how you work as well is sort of, it's a little bit more like an artist in a way as well. I don't know, could be. And I'm kind of quite curious about that, sort of, what do you, and this is something that I struggle a lot in the office as well, when, practicing as an architect, and you're basically, how do you say this, responding to a client brief. Your kind of point of start is always the kind of the approvals and the confirmations and I guess some of the projects that you're doing is kind of within that parameter as well. Even some of your installation pieces have a client brief. But is there a sort of an act of proactiveness that comes into some of the method that you do in order to sustain this kind of oasis of, or almost a paradise of, you were saying earlier, maybe you take a bit more time these days in order to complete something. How do you earn that luxury?
Yeah, it's difficult, isn't it? I mean, I actually quite enjoy a lot of the procedural aspects of architecture. That's my guilty pleasure, is writing architect's instructions. I quite get off on that. I do actually genuinely like the things that, I think the hoops that one has to jump through
Yeah.
are actually sort of really interesting. I quite like the discipline of those. I quite like having to sort of somehow, as you described, I think quite well, in the sense like make a space for what you're essentially trying to do, and then sort of fit it into this sort of series of strange hoops, which are like how architecture is procured and made. But at the same time, I think how architecture is procured and made has like a kind of quite a large amount of influence back. I mean, as you say quite rightly, you know, the exhibition at the RA, which was, you know, there's a lot of circumstance. There was like a moment in which that could have happened. There was a person, Owen Hopkins, who's like, actually, hey, you can do this. We've got 5 months. You can do this. So there's a client, there's a kind of fairly limited budget, which meant that they make things in a certain way. So it never would have been like that had there not been any of those constraints and certain circumstantial things. So you have to kind of accept and enjoy them, I think, really. And I quite like the sort of, like I said, I quite like some of the procedural aspects. I quite like the client conversations. I quite like the difficulty of the process. I think I'd probably find it slightly a bit like being a lottery winner. I'd find it slightly meaningless that your life wasn't a struggle anymore. You know, you think, well, what do I do now? I mean, the whole thing was just about how difficult everything is.
You must be like Palladio as a good politician as well. Palladio was a brilliant negotiator as well. Any other? No.
I was wondering, because you talk a lot about the origin of the project, if something starts from, it could be a narrative, it could be a Palladian villa, whatever, at which point does the project kind of become its own thing? Like, where does it go from being almost a design exercise to being a kind of a piece of architecture? Does it ever, you know, is it ever an artwork? Does that matter?
In truth, I think it's probably, well, tempting in some ways with the lecture and the title is that a lot of these things are obviously post-rationalizations. They don't necessarily exist at the moment of the designing bit. So, you know, an example might be with the columns in the RA show. Sort of just spend a lot of time drawing columns and drawing sort of, you know, ones projected in different ways, kind of slicing them off, without necessarily quite having a very coherent idea of what that meant and how it fitted in. And I suppose I'm really interested in the way the reciprocal relationship between those processes of drawing, perhaps semi-blind or not quite knowing what you're doing, and then a kind of trying to construct a sort of narrative that makes it make sense. And I think, you know, ultimately, for me, you know, there has to be a point at which that narrative comes together, but it's not like the pieces are made to illustrate a point, and it's not like they're an accumulation of sources. It might be that the source only gets sort of revealed a bit at the end in a way, and go, actually, this is a bit like something. So it's quite, for me, it's quite fluid, and it moves around a lot, and maybe only at the end do I start to sort of talk about them as having some kind of linear sort of process. But I guess it goes back to the point I was making before, that I feel quite happy for it to not to know a certain amount of the time. And so, because I think it would be quite deathly to kind of think that what you were doing was illustrating a sort of existing argument. That would feel like, well, if the argument, well, why make the object? Because, you know, I feel that a little bit with that kind of over-explication. When you go to an art gallery and there's a sign that says this work is about this, you go, well, if it really is, why not just have the sign? Because surely the work must be doing something else. Otherwise, why make it? So there must be a kind of ineffable and difficult and kind of fluid thing about the work. Otherwise, it would feel like you just write an email would be easier.
Yeah.
Hi, it's a sort of follow-up question to what you just mentioned. I'm sort of interested in knowing how deeply do you sort of get into the narrative in terms of maybe perhaps merging your personal meaning with the visual references that you find or that you happen to encounter by accident? How sort of deeply do you dive into maybe theory or maybe practical, maybe practical experimental research with materials or colors?
Yeah, I mean, bits of all of those things, really. I mean, I think this is the thing that I've sort of come to realise lately. I think the more that you do, the more it's impossible to think of anything without a sort of material and kind of fabric, colour, kind of quality, because you just kind of know that things have that at the end. And it's impossible to draw a thing and not go, okay, it has to be made of something. What is that made of? I think certainly when I was a student, I had a very difficult relationship with that because I sort of hadn't made anything. And I wasn't the kind of student who made a lot of things. I was the kind of student who tended to draw a lot more things, and I was happier to draw and happier to talk than I was to make. And I think, having practiced and sort of made things, now all of those things swim around, I suppose, I no longer sort of draw a thing and then think, well, how do you make it? That would seem a very odd way to go about it, because the material is intrinsic in some way. So, or it sort of emerges, I suppose. I mean, it's interesting, with a house for Essex, amazingly, in retrospect, it wasn't going to be made out of tiles at the beginning, which seems to me quite a weird idea. And I don't know what we're doing there, but it was going to be made out of plaster and with kind of this sort of Essex plastering technique. And at a certain point, it became clear that it should be made out of tiles. And then it all sort of fell into place. It couldn't have possibly been that thing without that decision. But I think for me, probably those decisions come earlier and earlier in the process now as a consequence of having done more. Not enough, obviously, but more.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Charles.
Thank you.
That was really, really enlightening, and I think, maybe just like the 1998 sort of period, I think we're sort of slightly encountering an age of good taste right now. And it's quite sort of, it's very refreshing to have this kind of challenging approach. But anyway, thank you so much for your
Pleasure.
Talk. We have some drinks in the room there, and also some of our TSA Forum workshop books from last year about Dennis Lunsden and Hawksmoor on the tables down there. So thanks. And if you want to stay for more chat with Charles, hopefully he'll stay as well for drinks.
Over there having a drink.
Thanks so much. That was really, really